Good evening, everyone. I'd like to begin tonight by recognising that we meet on Aboriginal land and pay respects to the Gadigal people and their elders for the use of their land. This evening really emanated from a number of concerns raised over several years now by vet teachers about the workload issues, particularly associated with being part of the national training frameworks, the constant demands to update training, change training, record all these sorts of things, and what's also a sense of taking away from teacher professionalism and professional judgment, in that if you're just delivering a training module or an assessment module, you're not actually doing the work of a teacher in assessing the students and the students' needs. You're not feeling professionally valued when you've constantly got to redo your knife skills or something like that. So teachers came to us as the Teachers Federation, but also to our colleagues in the Independent Education Union, and said, we're concerned about vet, about where vet's going, and about what we're doing. And what really it seems to be is we're losing the education part out of vocational education and training. And that's what we want to reinsert and re-establish. It's also of concern when you look at the deregulation of vet and certainly the attacks on TAFE. The ability in our schools for potentially people who aren't trained teachers to teach vet is also an issue that's of concern. So what we wanted to do is start a conversation statewide around what is going on in vet and where would we like to take vet in schools. And essentially we've read some of Kira Clarke's work and a number of papers by other people too, to actually look at what are the issues faced in New South Wales, what are the issues across Australia. We're moving the debate this afternoon on from a debate just about workload and work pressure to actually an examination of vet, the purpose of vet in schools, and what we should be doing. So on that note, I'd like to introduce to you Kira Clarke. Kira is a lecturer in vocational education. She's written a significant number of papers and also studied vet in schools across Australia. And I think she can give us some very valuable insights that will then allow both the Independent Education Union and the Teachers Federation to think about the issues raised and to begin developing policy and communicating with members around these issues and getting feedback from members on the issues. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Kira and I'd like you all to welcome her. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and I'd like to add my thanks to the traditional owners on the land on which we gather this evening and acknowledge that they have been, are and always will be the custodians on the land on which we live, work and learn. I'm really happy to be here tonight and I really appreciate you taking the time to come along. I am going to share with you some of our findings from 5 years of research on vet in schools and weave that into a little bit of a critique of the new national framework of vet in schools that was released at the end of last year. I'm going to try and draw out some specific comments and observations about New South Wales because it has been national research that we're doing, which has been exciting but challenging to look at the different approaches, different models and different challenges that we see right across the country. But I guess I will try and make some state-specific observations because I know everyone knows that there are differences between the different systems. So essentially what I'd like to do today is put the discussion of vet in schools where it should be, which is in a broader discussion of senior secondary education. I think too often vet in schools is marginalised both in practice and also in the way we think about it and talk about it in policy and research, and it is a core mainstream feature of senior secondary education in Australia. So that's how I'm going to contextualise it tonight. To provide a little bit of an illustration of what have been the current practices and recent changes in the provision of vet for young people in Australia, to look at some of the mythology, particularly the retention myth around vet in schools and the role that vet in schools can play and does play in retaining young people and addressing the issues of early school leaving. As I said, provide a bit of a critique, nothing too bolshy, of the new national framework, and also to draw out from the research what we see as some of the core features or core ingredients that need to be included in future reform in this space. Really happy to take questions at the end. If I say anything that's completely off the wall at any point, please just ask a question, and I will make the slides available after this evening. So if you feel like I'm whipping through it, that you can have the slides to have a look at later. So as I said, contextualising our discussion of vet in schools within the broader landscape of senior secondary education. And senior secondary education, like other aspects of schooling and education in this country, is not immune to being torn apart and discussed and unpacked in the media and in the public discourse. A lot of the press, a lot of the media around vet is not positive and has not been positive for quite a long time. Not living up to scratch to the expectations of employers, dodgy private providers, TAFE cuts. There's a very negative image and a negative discourse out there in the public around vet, which only further contextualises the challenges and tensions we might face in this space. So when I say I want to contextualise it in terms of senior secondary education more broadly, what do I mean by that? I guess I say that in a way of saying senior secondary education or senior secondary curriculum in New South Wales and Sydney in Australia was traditionally designed to pave a pathway for a small elite to university. Even though that's not the landscape we see today in terms of the number of young people staying on, that is essentially how our senior secondary curriculum and programs are still designed. They're still very much pitched and developed towards paving a pathway to university. Recent Australian and state and territory-based changes to curriculum reform and curriculum provision in the senior secondary years has opened up availability and access to vocational and technical programs, but missing within this reform and missing within this development has been a coherent program or a coherent pathway to technical and vocational occupations in the same way we provide pathways to professional careers and professional occupations. So what role are our schools playing in building an effective foundation for those who aspire to or imagine their future in a vocational or technical job or occupation? So I guess two questions that I have in the back of my mind when I go through this material is, how are we preparing young people for what lies beyond school? Are we looking beyond getting the ATAR, finishing the HSC? Are we preparing them for what lies beyond? And what are we sacrificing for the aspiration building project? Some of you may be familiar with the Bradley Review of Higher Education a few years ago. The key outcomes of that being this very strong focus on building aspiration for university. There's been a lot of money around, there's been a lot of money given to universities and schools to build pathways for disadvantaged young people to university. But what I hope to show through the research I share with you tonight is that vet in schools has been one of the big losers in this aspiration building program, and that has been sacrificed for the stronger focus on university pathways. I'm a bit of a data nerd, promise not to drown you in data too much tonight, but I think a few stats help us understand the patterns and the trends that we're talking about. So we know that higher levels of qualifications mean better chances in the labour market for young people. So looking at, I've got Victorian data here, I will have some New South Wales later on. This is looking at those who are working age, 15 to 64, with the lowest qualified in blue down the bottom, with post-school qualifications, with the highest qualified, down the bottom, with Year 12 and without Year 12. Statistics are consistent, the patterns are long-lasting. Those who leave school without any further post-school qualifications spend a long time struggling to find sustainable, well-paid, satisfying employment. Why is this relevant? This comes to the issue of the myth or the mythology of retention for vet in schools. One of the strong arguments in any policy paper you look at right across the country when it comes to why do we offer vet in schools is because it retains those young people who might otherwise leave school early. What we actually see in terms of the role that vet plays for 15 to 19-year-olds is that our early school leavers are our dominant users of vet in schools. So it's actually not living up to the mythology of retention. We can see for male and female down the bottom, these are young people who've completed school and then gone on to vet. They're our smallest users of vet, either vet in schools or post-school vet. We can see in the middle, male and female, 15 to 19-year-olds who are engaged in vet in schools, making up that cohort. And then the two lines at the top, in green, male early school leavers, and in purple, female, young people are opting out of the HSC, opting out of the VCE, opting out of a senior secondary qualification to take up vet outside school, outside the traditional context or traditional training environment that we expect young Australians 15 to 19 to be engaged in. So what has been the broader context around this, both socially, politically and economically? Australia has one of the worst retention rates in post-compulsory education of any OECD country in the world. We also have the national co-ag targets that have very explicitly positioned vocational education as a vocational equivalent to completing Year 12. So a young person who has a Certificate 2 is considered to have attained a position equal to someone who's completed high school. I'm sure I don't need to labour the point that there are some issues with that level of equality that's being very explicitly outlined in our policy. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the learn or earn rhetoric that's now present right across the country, that's changed and almost coerces in some instances the capacity of young people to be mobile between education, training and employment in those younger years. I call this a macro sociological phenomena because the retention rhetoric and the retention pressure that we now have within these learn or earn policies actually has been proven to have a really big impact on the way in which young people perceive the benefit and the value of completing senior secondary education. Since the emergence of the learn or earn policies, we've actually seen a change in the choice and decisions that young people are making, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a minute. So let's have a look at where we stand now on a national framework with the new policy in place that was released at the end of last year. We were well overdue for a little bit of an update to the vet in schools policy because this is where we were until the end of last year. We had a policy statement from 2000, so we're a bit overdue for an update. All through our research, we use this policy language as a jumping off point for our discussions and consultations with teachers, vet practitioners and policymakers, and it's the language in bold that we really focused on, this idea of enhancing their transition to a broad range of post-school options and pathways. Was participation in vet in schools strengthening outcomes? Was it enhancing their choices and options? And was it leaving the door open for mobility and change of decision and change of mind later on post-school? Or was it narrowing in? So this is where we are now. I could speak for 45 minutes purely on my issues with the title of this national policy framework. But I'm probably preaching to the choir, so I won't. What I will do is focus on the four key ideas that come out of this national framework. Seems to be a bit of a policy trend in recent years. If you have a brand new shiny fancy policy, it needs to have 4 Cs or 3 Rs or whatever. So we're going to go through the 4 Cs. And interestingly, there's language that comes explicitly through under each of these 4 Cs that has been contradicted and pulled apart in the consultations that we've had with practitioners and stakeholders like yourself over the last 5 years. So it'll be interesting to look at that contrast between the different views. So we'll start with clarity. In travelling around the country with my colleagues and speaking to vet practitioners and vet and school stakeholders, terminology was one of the first things that people mentioned. It was about status, it was about the fact that vet in schools was seen as not real vet, pretend vet. It was that it had this cultural baggage with it, that it was for the dumb kids, the hard to manage kids, the kids who did the stuff with their hands and the portables out the back. That being said, there wasn't much belief that a change in name was really magically overnight going to fix all of that. But certainly terminology was one of the first things tackled in this new national framework. So the framework really tries to bring about a move away from the vet in schools moniker to making a distinction between vocational education as that which is on the AQF, certified, nationally recognised, and what it sees as vocational learning, which is something much broader, much more encompassing of a range of applied and disciplinary learning that goes on within schools. I think what we'll see in the next couple of years, this is me with my crystal ball, is that as each of the states and territories go through their reform processes in vet in schools, as many are, we'll start to see this sort of distinction picked up. The extent to which it has any real impact on the ground, of course, remains to be seen. So in what ways did the research and the voices of practitioners really highlight the need for greater clarity in making that distinction between vet that's certified and recognised and the broader important role of applied learning in schools? So practitioners very clearly told us that any reforms, any change, any strengthening to vet in schools really needed to acknowledge the foundational nature of what we provide in schools, that we are not providing tickets to jobs, that we're not providing the last qualification our students will ever need, but simply a stepping stone to further post-school education and training. For this reason, I think it's nice to see the vocational learning idea actually teased out in the national framework, because one of the great difficulties, and I've heard it from some of your colleagues here in New South Wales, is the very close alignment between how vet in schools is run and the senior secondary certificates make it quite challenging to offer vocational programs in the junior years, which is where we know a lot of the career aspirations, the gender stereotypes about male and female jobs, and the really getting your hands dirty and working out what kind of job I might want. A lot of that thinking and development goes on in the junior years. Current provision of vet in schools being tied to the HSC, tied to the QCE, tied to the SACE, makes some of that earlier access a little bit more challenging. So a lot of the practitioners we spoke to said we need to explore coherent, formalised ways of making sure Year 7s and 8s have access to applied and vocational learning. The second key theme coming through in the national framework is this idea of collaboration. The language they actually use is effective vocational learning and vet depend on collaboration. Central to this is bringing schools and employers together. One of the first observations we made of the language in the framework was the use of employers quite explicitly as opposed to industry. There's a lot of negative press around the lack of employer voice or the lack of industry voice in vet in schools, and we all know that industry has a voice, whether it's at the Board of Studies level, looking at the training packages, assessing what's appropriate to be delivered in schools. But this national framework attempts to move beyond that, to look more explicitly at the localised and grassroots level collaborations between schools and employers. This is not necessarily a space that schools have experience in or have traditionally engaged in. It's not necessarily a space, I think, that we could expect schools to be able to pick up and run with without the guidance and support and sort of planning and accountability at a state and regional level. So we looked a lot with our partners in the research on, what is it that enables or would facilitate greater partnerships with employers? What is it that's needed at a school level to make sure these collaborations aren't just a flash in the pan, 1 year program, fantastic, great engagement rates, but then next year it's on to something else? What builds the sustainability and longevity of these collaborations? And time again, the answer was coherent support and planning from the centre. We need someone to tell us that we're not doing the wrong thing. We need people to tell us that what we're offering in school is going to have some currency and some viability for our young people when they leave. So again, the message coming through from our stakeholders was that any redevelopment in vet in schools needs to think about how the entry-level qualifications that we're primarily working with in vet in schools actually enables broader exploration of related occupations. And this isn't something that schools can do on their own. So I might use a little bit of an example here. I often use the example of allied health. If a young person is engaged in a certificate in aged care, they may think at 15, 16 that aged care is something they want to go into, but they may not have had that opportunity to actually explore the related occupations. The competencies they're developing are not just relevant and create mobility to one occupation, they create mobility to a range of related occupations within that industry stream. Current approaches to vet in schools don't always open up that opportunity to be industry broad rather than occupation specific. It's one of the key messages also coming from young people themselves, that they know when they go out to the workplaces, they can see their peers in these other areas, working in the other occupational areas. They want the opportunity to actually explore stuff that's related to what they're actually focused on. So how do we actually go about creating those pathways? They're not inherent in the curriculum, they're not inherent in the training packages. It's not something that happens already in the broader vet sector. This is new work, this is new innovation that needs to happen within the school's framework. Now this is where I get in trouble. We hear a lot, the vet is vet mantra. Is that something that gets said here in New South Wales? A few shakes of head. I wonder if New South Wales is an anomaly. We hear this a lot. We heard this over and over again in our research, that we need to build the prestige and the status of vet in schools because it's not pretend vet, it's not dummy vet, it's vet. Vet at schools is the same as all other vet. My question is, should it be? Yes, we should be aiming for all the vet that young people do in schools to be the same as post-school vet? Okay. This is where I'm definitely going to get myself into trouble. One of the strong pieces of evidence we see coming through in the research is the qualifications that young people need while at school to build the foundation for post-school success is not necessarily possible within the occupationally specific qualifications that we currently use in vet in schools. A simple way we often hear people say this is that the education component is missing from these qualifications, that they don't have inherent within them the learning about, the learning in and the learning for the industry in which young people are going to go into. I'll unpack that in a bit more detail in a minute. So I guess what I'm getting at is, do we want a system where vet is the same right through from 15 onwards, or do we need a more specific youth-focused vocational provision to meet the unique and youth needs of that cohort? There's two pieces of language I want to draw your attention to in relation to confidence from the national framework, and this is this idea of alongside core curriculum. Vet students can study vet courses alongside core curriculum, and the idea of the shared marketplace. It's very consistent in the national framework and also in some of our state and territory-based policy documents that vet is positioned as this choice that young people can choose alongside their core mainstream disciplinary curriculum. I often use the example of students who are going off to university. They've got their heart set on it, they know they're going to university. They construct for themselves a package of disciplinary curriculum that they know will get them into the university course of their choice. They're flooded with newspaper lift-outs, guides on, science and maths and English and humanities and languages, which curriculum is going to maximise their pathway, which curriculum is going to provide the best foundation for their university study. Culturally, we don't have the same level of structure, support and provision for students who engage in vocational programs. We don't have the same flood of information about, you want to go off and be an electrical technician, this is the vocational curriculum and this is the disciplinary curriculum that you don't do alongside, that you do together in a complementary, coherent pathway. I'd like to draw on the work of a Scottish academic, Gallagher, who provides a really good, very simple framework for thinking about why is this so important at this point in time? Why, when the vet sector and the vet system of qualifications has been working so well, do we need to change what we do in schools? Why is there evidence that we need to move away from having an all-encompassing system? So drawing on his work, one of the things we identify and observe is that the new national framework reinforces a reliance on the foundational qualifications. So predominantly Certs 1 to 2. There's a little bit of a provision at Cert 3 and 4, but the vast majority of provision is at those foundational levels. They have little to no currency in the labour market. Yet our evidence of what young people do post-vet in schools, the vast majority of them go directly into the labour market with no further education or training. We'd like to think they take that qualification and access a higher level post-school, but tracking studies here in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and South Australia show us that the vast majority of our vet and school students go straight into the labour market, into the same sorts of jobs that our university students are doing part-time, what my colleague John Polisel refers to as the cash register and the hamburger flip. It's the low-skilled, casualised and unrelated to their vocational area jobs that we see them going into. So the new framework has retained this reliance on the narrowly defined occupational structural basis for vocational curriculum. We're still choosing vocational programs based on a single occupation or a single job. Am I getting into trouble yet? So Gallagher talks about, if we're thinking about our qualifications and thinking about what we're using, what questions should we be asking about the efficacy of our qualifications? And he's got a 3-point test. Qualifications should provide entry to work, should provide entry to higher level qualifications, and should widen access to tertiary education. That's his 3-point test for qualifications. If we hold this up against current approaches to vet in schools, how does vet in schools hold up? So current models of vet in schools right across the country provide limited entry to meaningful work. Entry to work, yes, limited entry to meaningful work. The kind of work we would hope our young people would have access to. Sustainable, non-casualised, satisfying, skilled work. We know from the tracking studies they provide limited access to higher level qualifications. This is where I often get myself into trouble, particularly in Victoria, where we know that if someone completes a vocational qualification in schools, TAFEs and RTOs have to recognise it. We know that's law, we know that's requirement, we know it often doesn't happen. We know that young people take qualifications to other providers who say, oh, you just got that at school, you're going to have to repeat it. We know that that happens. And also we know that there's a very strong social pattern we see in our vet in schools classrooms that means it's actually playing a limited role in widening access to tertiary education. The rates of transition from vet in schools to diploma and above qualifications and into bachelor programs is low, and in some states and territories it's in the decline. So that's all the depressing news. Moving on to the final aspect of the framework is the idea of core systems. I think this is actually quite interesting language, and I think they're probably just looking for another C, and some policy bods in a room somewhere came up with core systems. It's never been used in the policy language before. This language talks about greater system-led development and guidance, which I think is a really positive thing to see, given the strong message from practitioners, from schools, from local policymakers about the need for a more coherent system-led approach. So the first responsibility of core systems is to provide that clear guidance and to involve the different range of stakeholders in the delivery of vocational curriculum for secondary students. One of the real joys of conducting this research over the last 5 years was that we went around the country twice, and in each capital city we sat down roundtables of stakeholders from schools, from all the 3 different sectors, from TAFE, from group training organisations, from industry. These were, in most cases, these were people who had the same ideas about vet in schools, felt the same need for reform, but had never actually been in a room together with the other stakeholders in the picture. So the need to enable and facilitate this cross-stakeholder discourse is a really important one, and I hope that we move beyond the rhetoric of a framework like this to actually see some more of that cross-stakeholder collaboration going on. Within the core systems, there's a further iteration of two key users, stakeholders, people of core importance within vet and schools policy, students and employers. So even though we're talking about an educational framework, we're talking about schools, employers are positioned quite explicitly within this framework as one of the key stakeholders and the key people to keep in mind. Meeting the expectations of them is considered vital, in the words of the policy. Why do I get a little bit of a shudder when I see employers so explicitly positioned on equal footing, on equal balance with students in a policy like this that's designed to address how we provide education in schools? I think one of the things that really has started to trouble me around the language we see in vet in schools in recent years is the neoliberal market perspective. That you probably haven't experienced it quite to the extent that we have in Victoria with our fully contestable vet market, but we've certainly seen the construction of vet learners in school and out school as consumers. There is full choice. They are expected to have the agency and the knowledge and the information to make choices that will support their transition and to support their job outcomes. What research here in Australia and in other Anglophone systems shows us is that that assumption is really problematic. That within a marketised system, particularly our young people coming from really disadvantaged backgrounds, coming from backgrounds where there's a lack of social capital in informing and supporting their choices, that they are put further behind, that they are further marginalised and disadvantaged when we make assumptions of choice and agency. We also know young people pick up on those status ideas, they pick up on the courses that teachers and principals don't think they should be doing, and they self-select into programs based on images and responses to that culture within the schools. I want to finish off now. I've probably whipped through that really quickly. No, I'm all right. I want to finish off now with a few observations about the school practice implications. So I've been speaking at the macro policy trends level. What does this actually mean for what we might do in schools? What implications does this have for how we might innovate, how we might collaborate, how we might develop at a school and at a regional level? So I've been doing some work with colleagues and practitioners in a range of disadvantaged schools in regional Victoria, and it's some of those ideas I'd like to draw on now. I currently work with John Polisell and used to work with Richard Teese, and this is an extract of theirs that I go back to throughout our work, that I think really highlights that when we're talking about the vet and schools provision and we're talking about the transitions of young people, we're talking about it within this context of a very unforgiving and rapidly changing economic environment. If we as researchers, teachers and policymakers can barely keep up with the changes and the changing implications and requirements, it's very hard to expect young people to have that capacity to be able to be mobile and think quickly. This is where we get to the New South Wales specific stuff, and I love these maps. I think they're quite powerful. Has anyone seen the ABS Social Atlas maps before? Yeah, a few nods. If you haven't seen them before, just Google ABS Social Atlas Sydney, and you'll drown in maps of Sydney of different statistics that are really interesting. I've just pulled out two to look at today. I'm hoping I've positioned them side by side. I lived in Sydney but left when I was a teenager, so my geography is not great. I'm assuming that's central eastern Sydney on the right, and this, if I positioned it right, sort of, on the left, yeah. This looks at people in the labour force with university qualifications. The darker the orange-red colour, the greater the density of university qualifications. So essentially, inner central Sydney has a larger number of people who are very qualified, have been to university. Fewer university qualifications in the outskirts. The next map I'm going to show you is people in the labour force where their highest qualification is a Certificate 3. industry qual, apprenticeship qualification, traditional trades is what we're thinking. I can show you the same map for Melbourne, exactly the same thing. Central Melbourne University, outskirts of Melbourne, Certificate 3. Similar things for Brisbane with the southern suburbs, similar things for Adelaide. Northern suburbs is where the trade qualifications are. We can look at similar maps for young people who are not engaged in education or training. So 15 to 24-year-olds who are not engaged in education or training and are not engaged in employment. And the overlap is really quite shocking. This is where we see the overlap. Where the Cert 3 qualifications are, that's where we see the disengagement amongst young people. So what does this mean for the implications of how we build understanding, aspiration, and pathways to technical and vocational qualifications in this social geographic context? So we know that labour market jobs are changing. We know that historically vocational curriculum has prepared young people for the same or similar jobs to the jobs of their parents. But we know that the way in which people were trained for jobs even 10 years ago is not the same way we're training them now. We know that young people and their agency and their understanding and their mobility within the complex youth transitions environment is constrained and can be limited. Human capital theory tells us any qualification's a good qualification. I know they're probably going to go out and get a job post-school. I just want to get them the piece of paper because it might be the only piece of paper they ever get. I know that underpins a lot of the work we do in vet and schools. But we know, if we know that that piece of paper is next to worthless, why are we holding on to it so much? This is one of the questions that we posed when we spoke with teachers and students as part of this research. You're telling us that the paper that these young people get when they leave is not going to get them a job. The employees are telling us this isn't the piece of paper we want young people to have when they come to us. So what are we going to do about it? I think the voices of students and teachers say it best, so I'll leave the last word to them. Teachers tell us that vet and schools is all about skills for jobs, knowledge for jobs, pathways to jobs. But they also tell us that young people, it's just too early, it's too young. How can they decide at 16 or 17 that this is the occupation for me, this is where I want to be for the foreseeable future? I had a conversation with a few people before this evening started, and the idea that vet and schools is easier, both for students and for teachers, is another part of the mythology that's maintained and created around, you know, what we do for vocational education students, that it's the softer option. It's for the students who aren't coping very well. What do students tell us? How much of that mythology do they pick up on themselves? Which one? I think that middle one. I heard one of my teachers say you shouldn't do vet subjects as they scale you down. You're too smart to do vet. Why would you want to do vet? Oh, don't do vet, it won't get you anywhere. The amount of times we hear that language or, you know, overhear that language in schools and the way it disenfranchises or disempowers young people. I've got enough time, so I'll share a quick anecdote with you from Queensland. We did vet and schools research with young people right across the country, but Queensland is the one that I think will haunt me and stays in my mind, and I think is why I get so worked up and passionate about vet and schools. We were in an industrial suburb, light industrial area, very high youth unemployment rates, very high early school leaving rates. But this was a cohort of Year 12s who had stayed on and were doing vet. They were doing a particular manufacturing qualification. And I spoke to all of them one-on-one and did surveys, and as you do, and said, so, manufacturing, it's a really interesting qualification. I haven't spoken to anyone else who's doing this particular cert. Why'd you choose it? What do you mean, why'd I choose it? Look out the window, they're just training us for the factories. We didn't get a choice. I was told this is what I was doing. Every single student in that class had a similar story, but same idea. So the construction of that culture within the schools is something that the students see straight through, and is something that I get quite disturbed by when I hear about it. And these are just some more quotes that I think continue that narrative, continue that idea of how is my choice, how is my transition, how is my pathway being socially constructed for me or socially constructed around me by where I live and where I am? I think I've repeated one of the quotes there. I'm going to skip through that one and get to this. I'm going to finish. Always good to finish on a picture because I feel like I've just talked really fast for 40 minutes. One of the final questions we asked as we went around the country, speaking to our practitioners, and they were fascinating events. We put a couple of tape recorders on the table. We let them speak for 3 or 4 hours. That's pretty much how we conducted the research. But one of the final questions we always asked was about what needs to change. What kind of switch do we need to flick? What kind of reform do we need to make to address the biggest challenge that you're facing in this space? What's the big thing that needs to change? And I think this image here is what captures the biggest change that we heard. This idea that VET in schools at a policy level, at a community level, at a school level needs to move from this outer orbit idea where it's alongside the mainstream curriculum, it's alongside the mainstream teachers as opposed to the VET teachers, it's alongside the university pathway. It needs to move from outer orbit to an embedded core. Embedded core in senior secondary education, embedded core in youth transitions, and embedded core in school business. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kira. Look, I'd like to build on that because without you guys here giving up your time of an afternoon, this forum wouldn't have worked. So thank you very much. Thank you to the New South Wales Teachers Federation, to Joan and to Mary down the back for the organisation that's gone into this afternoon. Kira at the outset referred to herself as a data nerd, but it's great data. I'm an anecdote nerd. And I'm the union official that goes into lots of high schools where they teach VET, and I respect your view, John, that standalone facilities, by the sound of yours, has got a distinct advantage. So the one in Port Macquarie as well, and Southern Cross in Burwood, I think, and I've been to a range of other ones. I've also been to the ones that failed, the trade training colleges, and I've seen some absolute... I could list off half a dozen of those that just fell to pieces, and they're pretty public knowledge. There's nothing secretive about the failure of that model. But look, the anecdotes have bounced around the room without me labelling them too far, but the dual accreditation, the constant retraining, the searching for VET qualifications, where are they, and putting them back into the databases, the record keeping. As I ran out this afternoon, John Quessy, our General Secretary, said it's time to put the teacher back in the driver's seat. And I think that picks up on what Joan said at the outset of today, that teacher professionalism is the key to understanding where we're headed. We need teachers' professional judgment in the vocational education VET space. It's important. It is the secret ingredient. And I'd love to think that we could have... not 2 masters, but 1 master in the space. But it really is opening it up for discussion. We are in a fluid state, but in the Catholic sector, we've got a bit of a space opening up as one of the outcomes of our recently negotiated agreement with the 11 New South Wales Catholic dioceses. We are allowed to negotiate that space where we can have further discussions about how VET operates. Now, it is complex, as you said. It's run by a very tight model between the independent, the department and the Catholic sectors, and it is in there, and teachers have got to crawl back into that space. So happy to work with you. Thanks again to Kira. Your insights, I have read some of the papers, and if you Google Kira, it's quite astounding, her studies and the impact I'm hoping in New South Wales will be considerable. We don't want to be in outer orbit. We don't want teachers in outer orbit. We want them in the embedded core. And I think this meeting's opened up with great discussion around that. So thank you very much for joining us. And thank you again to the Fed, and a special thanks to Kira. So, thank you.